Hello, my name's Antonia Kayat. I'm from Nicholas Hare Architects. In terms of design for performance, what impact has it had in Australia on the way they procure buildings in terms of the contracts, traditional design and build, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. The quick answer is that they have all the quirks and fragmentation in their procurement that we have. The critical thing is that because they've set a performance target right at the beginning of the project, it's like a relay race. That performance target baton gets handed on to whoever's taking over the responsibility for the next stage of the building. And it hasn't, as is clearly demonstrated, it hasn't prevented them from achieving efficient buildings. But it is a challenge we will have to face in our market. It can be overcome by making this very concrete commitment to a performance outcome.
Chris Twin, consultant. To follow up on that, period I worked in Sydney, as you know, I saw it, and that was 8 years ago. When I was in Arup's office out there, looking at implementing neighbours, we saw two things. One, the consultant felt they had to be involved all the way through the process, from that early conceptual point all the way through to the predecessor of soft landings. Whereas here, contractually, we're normally cut and diced at every stage. You might have different consultants helping you through planning versus then doing some initial design, then the contractor takes over, D&B, another contestant, so forth and so on. So we saw continuity at that level. And then another component was almost the power of veto of the contractor over who the consultant was, because their contracts were made back to back. You are obliged to deliver these targets, Mr. Contractor. Mr. Contractor then turns around and says, this consultant has no track record of delivering to targets. So there was an interesting interplay. And there was then, therefore, at that stage, a very small subset of consultants and contractors and clients who would work together, who could all trust themselves on certain kinds of jobs. So I'm interested to understand, that was a snapshot where you see those sorts of things beginning to influence here, hopefully to the good of our industry, or whether we can continue on an element of business as usual in contractual arrangements.
There is certainly a sort of KPI culture in Australia where the supply chain is judged on its track record at delivering, highly rated buildings. And that, it certainly would apply to M&E designers, but it equally applies to managing agents. Once the building is in operation, that they are now required, when they're bidding to take on a owner's portfolio, to tell the owner what neighbours ratings they have in the buildings that they manage. So I'll just one other quick comment before others might want to say something, because my answer to the previous question was slightly simplistic. It was taking the question quite literally. There is another aspect to Australia which is a very critical part of their success, which is that in Australia, the owner of the building looks after the building, and they look after the whole building, so including the building services in individual tenants' demises. And if a tenant is unhappy with the conditions in their part of the building, they have to contact the owner of the building or the landlord to get it put right. And this is a way of working that was quite common in this country decades ago, but essentially the owners of buildings found it in their interest to outsource or delegate responsibility for tenant spaces to the tenants. And the tenants were fed up with landlords giving them a poor service in responding to complaints, and the landlords were only too happy to offload that responsibility to the tenants. So we now have a lot of high-end offices where you can have 10 different tenants, 10 different facility management teams, 10 different BMSs in the building. It's hopelessly inefficient from a financial perspective and from an energy perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of the Design for Performance project here in the UK, there are several things that I want to say. First of all is we need to learn from the experience in Australia, but not necessarily replicate what they do. It needs to be appropriate for the context of the UK market, and that's one of the key considerations of the project going forward. What are the differences in the markets? How do they operate? And actually the scheme needs to be able to reflect those differences. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that, as you will have seen, whilst there are a number of significant supporters of Design for Performance in terms of the industry bodies, the developers, the delivery partners, they are relatively small in number. I think that's inevitable at the beginning of something like this. But one of the key parts of the Design for Performance project will be to try and upskill the industry. So I think to begin with, we will see a relatively small pool of developers who demand these buildings, of contractors who are happy to deliver them, of consultants who are also happy to work on them, of managing agents who are happy to manage to that standard. But one of the things that we're trying to do is essentially kind of accelerate the process. Where Australia has taken 20 years to get to the point it is, we might hopefully take a little bit less time than that to improve our buildings, because we can learn from what they do and build upon it. And the third thing I want to mention, which is slightly tangential, but also makes the same point, you talk about the role of consultants, and I think one of the kind of models, if you like, for Design for Performance and the Australian model is very much around the role of the consultants, lots of external advisors. I think what Design for Performance needs to do in the UK here is make sure that we reflect not only the market evolutions, but also the technological evolutions. So when we talk about things like fine-tuning, monitoring, etc., if we use new technologies such as building analytics to help that process, again, there's a role for another set of people coming forward to help contribute to this. So my overall point is, we will start with a small pool of people, but the idea is to industry upskill. But secondly, the scheme needs to be made appropriate for the UK market, not only in terms of the conditions we operate, but also in terms of evolutions in technology and so on.
Pete Mitchell, Build Energy. I wondered if you could just expand on the point about enhanced or advanced modelling and what that actually means in terms of, are we talking about DSM level 5 stuff or something else?
It goes beyond dynamic simulation level 5, substantially beyond, and fundamentally you have to include in your model a description of the HVAC system and its controls, and model the operation of the HVAC time step by time step. Now it's interesting to note that two of the models that are market leaders in Australia are IES and EDSL's TAS. So the UK is sort of brilliantly creating the software that you need to use to create buildings that perform as they're designed, but we're failing to use that software in our home country. So that is one thing that we've got to put right. There's other software available, like Design Builder linked into Energy Plus. Those are the three main packages that are used in Australia. And just to mention what Julie was saying, that the models are used in Australia to do thermal comfort analysis for the buildings at the same time. And the new code in Australia, there's a new building code which is already out in a draft form and will come into force in May this year, has stipulations around using this advanced modelling for not just for energy, but also for thermal comfort.
And I suppose I was going to say, Julie, that opens up whole new opportunities around, that type of modelling for the industry, as well as obviously offering benefits to the buildings themselves.
Yeah, I mean, personally, if we even just moved away from just a barter model to actually thinking about the user occupancy profiles that we put in, the kit we put in, etc., even without going through the HVAC module, I would be pretty happy. I think it would already make quite a big difference, especially on some building types.
I just want to make one more quick comment, because I think this is a really exciting opportunity. I mean, if you are an M&E designer, the ability to design buildings using advanced simulation will open up a whole new landscape for your talents. And we've already had one of our pioneer projects that has been through this process, and the feedback from both the engineers and the developer of the building has been extraordinary. They are just overwhelmed by how much they've learnt about what they thought their building was doing according to the design, and what it really would do if it, according to the model, if they built it as previously designed. And they're now changing the design so that it will, the model is showing it will be well controlled, and if they build it as designed, then it will be well controlled.